Humanity's search for meaning has always been closely tied to religion. As societies changed, so did their beliefs. In the beginning, people needed explanations for the natural world around them. They saw life, death, and the forces of nature as mysteries that demanded answers. From the earliest prehistoric burial rituals, we see evidence that humans were already thinking about what happens beyond life. These were not sophisticated religious systems, but they were the starting points. In the earliest days, animism took root. This was a belief that everything trees, rivers, mountains was alive with spirit. It wasn't about worshiping a single god, but recognizing that the world was full of spiritual presence. Animism wasn't just superstition, it was a response to the world's unpredictability. When people depended entirely on nature for survival, their beliefs mirrored that dependence. Animistic beliefs helped give meaning to the changing seasons, the behavior of animals, and even death itself.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more topics you love.
As societies began to settle and farm, religious thought grew more structured. Agriculture changed everything. Suddenly, survival wasn't just about hunting or gathering, it was about managing crops and livestock. The deities that people worshiped became more specific: gods of fertility, gods of rain, gods of the sun. These deities controlled the success of crops and livestock, so worship and ritual became essential to daily life. Religion wasn't just a belief system, it was a means of survival. Sacrifices, prayers, and rituals were ways to secure the favor of these gods and ensure that the land would remain fertile. Yet in ancient Egypt, religion became even more formalized. The gods weren't just powerful forces, they represented principles that governed the universe. The concept of a balance and order was central. Everything in life had to align with this principle. The pharaoh wasn't just a political leader, he was a divine figure responsible for maintaining this cosmic balance. Egyptians believed that if the pharaoh failed, chaos would take over. Religion here wasn't just about individual salvation, it was about the well-being of the entire society. Looking further east, Hinduism brought a different approach. With roots in ancient India, Hinduism introduced ideas that went beyond mere survival or the will of gods. Concepts like karma, dharma, and moksha made people consider their place in a larger cycle of existence. In this view, life wasn't just about pleasing the gods or ensuring a good harvest, it was about moral duty, ethical behavior, and ultimately breaking free from the cycle of birth and rebirth. This was the beginning of religious thought becoming more philosophical as people began to think about deeper questions. What is the purpose of life? How should one live? What happens after death? At this point, religion was starting to evolve into something much more than just a response to natural forces. It became a guide for how to live a good life, for understanding human nature, and for navigating moral choices. Ancient thinkers weren't just creating rituals, they were asking fundamental questions about existence. This is where religious thought starts to shift into the realm of philosophy. The arrival of the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam introduced new ideas about morality, justice, and the role of God. Judaism, one of the first monotheistic religions, presented a God who was both creator and lawgiver. And the laws laid out in the Torah provided not just religious guidelines, but also a framework for justice and ethical living. The belief that God had a covenant with his people gave them a sense of purpose and destiny, making religion both a spiritual and social force. Christianity expanded on this foundation with teachings that focused on love, compassion, and inner transformation. Jesus taught that what mattered wasn't just following the letter of the law, but embodying the spirit of love and forgiveness. This was a shift from external rituals to internal faith. His message wasn't just about religion, it was about reshaping the way people thought about relationships, morality, and salvation. Christianity's focus on grace and faith created a new dimension to religious thought. one that moved away from transactional sacrifices and rituals and toward personal redemption. Islam, coming centuries later, blended spiritual, social, and political elements into a comprehensive way of life. The Quran doesn't just offer religious guidance, it provides a detailed ethical framework for justice, charity, and governance. Islamic teachings emphasize the idea of submission to God's will, but also promote the idea that every individual is responsible for their actions. The 5 pillars of Islam are practical guidelines that ground this belief system in everyday life, blending faith with action. Islam unified vast regions under a shared belief system, showing how religion could be both a personal guide and a powerful social force. By this point, religious thought had become deeply intertwined with culture, ethics, and philosophy. The world's major religions were no longer just about survival or the forces of nature. They offered comprehensive worldviews. People began looking inward, thinking about their own responsibility, their purpose, and their place in a larger cosmic order. But as societies advanced, so did the challenges to these systems of belief. This is where the real turning point comes in. As human civilization entered the Enlightenment, religion faced challenges from new directions. Science and reason began to question the structures of faith that had stood for centuries. How could religious thought adapt to a world that was becoming more focused on logic and evidence? As human society progressed into the Enlightenment, the relationship between religion and thought started to shift dramatically. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason, logic, and evidence, challenged long-standing religious doctrines. For centuries, religion had been the dominant force explaining everything from the origins of the universe to the ethics of daily life. But now philosophers and scientists were questioning these ancient explanations. The shift wasn't immediate, but over time it sparked profound changes in how religious thought evolved. One of the central themes of the Enlightenment was the idea that human beings could use their reason to understand the world. No longer was knowledge based solely on faith or divine revelation. Thinkers like Immanuel Kant, David Hume, and John Locke argued that reason should be the foundation of our understanding. For them, faith was not enough to explain the mysteries of the universe. If something couldn't be observed, measured, or tested, it needed to be questioned. This had major implications for religious thought. Take the idea of miracles, for example. Religious texts from Christianity, Judaism, and Islam are filled with accounts of supernatural events, miracles that proved the power of God. But Enlightenment thinkers like Hume began to question whether these miracles could really be trusted as evidence of divine intervention. Hume famously argued that belief in miracles was based on unreliable testimony, not reason or evidence. In a world guided by reason, miracles seemed increasingly out of place. This wasn't an outright rejection of religion, though. Many Enlightenment thinkers were deeply religious, but they began to reinterpret their faith in light of reason. Kant, for example, didn't deny the existence of God. Instead, he sought to reconcile faith with reason, arguing that moral law, the sense of duty, and the concept of justice pointed to the existence of a higher power. For Kant, religion wasn't about blind belief in dogma, but about understanding the moral structure of the universe through rational thought. This movement toward reason didn't just challenge religious practices, it also changed how people thought about ethics. Before the Enlightenment, moral codes were closely tied to religious teachings. The Ten Commandments, for instance, laid out clear moral principles based on divine law. But during the Enlightenment, philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and John Stuart Mill argued that morality didn't need to come from religion. Instead, they said, humans could arrive at moral principles through empathy, reason, and the pursuit of happiness. This was a radical departure from the idea that morality was handed down by God. As science began to flourish during and after the Enlightenment, religious thought faced even more challenges. The discoveries of Copernicus and Galileo had already begun to shake the foundations of religious cosmology by proving that the Earth was not the center of the universe. These were more than just scientific breakthroughs, they were blows to the religious view of the cosmos. Suddenly, humanity's place in the universe seemed far less special, and the need for divine intervention to explain the workings of the natural world began to diminish. The publication of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species in 1859 marked another major turning point. Darwin's theory of evolution directly challenged the biblical account of creation. According to the book of Genesis, God created the world and all living beings in 6 days. But Darwin showed that life on Earth was far more ancient than previously thought, and that species evolved over time through natural selection without the need for divine intervention. This raised difficult questions for religious believers. How could they reconcile these scientific discoveries with their faith? Religious thought had to adapt. Some religious leaders rejected these new ideas outright, while others found ways to reconcile them with their beliefs. The Catholic Church, for example, eventually accepted many aspects of evolutionary theory, but argued that God had guided the process. This adaptation allowed religious thought to remain relevant in a world increasingly dominated by science. At the same time, new religious movements began to emerge, blending spiritual beliefs with Enlightenment values. Deism, for instance, became popular among intellectuals during the 18th century. Deists believed in a creator God, but rejected the idea of divine intervention in the daily affairs of humans. For them, God was like a clockmaker who had set the universe in motion and then stepped back to let it run according to natural laws. This was a way of reconciling the belief in God with the rationalism of the Enlightenment. Deism took hold among some of the founding thinkers of the American and French revolutions, showing how religious thought was continuing to evolve in response to changing intellectual currents. The impact of these developments on religion's role in society was profound. As scientific explanations for natural phenomena became more convincing, religion's authority over certain areas of knowledge started to decline. People no longer looked to religious leaders for explanations of how the universe worked. Instead, they turned to scientists, philosophers, and educators. But even as scientific understanding grew, religious thought didn't disappear. Instead, it found new ways to maintain relevance. One of the most significant shifts was the rise of liberal theology. Liberal theologians sought to reinterpret religious texts and beliefs to align with modern science and philosophy. They argued that religious stories, such as the creation account in Genesis, shouldn't be taken literally. Instead, these stories were seen as metaphorical, conveying deeper truths about the human experience rather than being historical accounts. This move toward liberal theology allowed religion to adapt to the changing world. It also made space for new discussions about the nature of faith, belief, and the divine. Religion wasn't simply being left behind by science, it was evolving to meet the challenges of modernity. This adaptability showed that religious thought wasn't static, it could change, grow, and respond to new ideas. As we move further into modern history, we see that religion and science aren't always at odds. In fact, many of the greatest scientists, Newton, Einstein, and others, were deeply spiritual people. They saw no contradiction between their scientific work and their belief in a higher power. For them, understanding the laws of the universe was another way of appreciating the divine. This highlights a key point in the evolution of religious thought: faith and reason can coexist. At the same time, the tension between traditional religious beliefs and modern science continues to shape debates in our world today. Discussions around evolution, climate change, and bioethics are just a few areas where religion and science intersect and sometimes clash. Yet religious thought continues to play a crucial role in shaping ethical discussions in these areas. As we've seen, religious thought has evolved in response to intellectual revolutions like the Enlightenment and the rise of science. It adapted, changed, and found new ways to remain relevant in a rapidly changing world. But what's next? Now, let's step into the modern world. Religious thought continues to evolve, responding to forces that are reshaping our societies at an unprecedented pace. The world is more connected than ever, thanks to technology, globalization, and the internet. At the same time, the rise of secularism and scientific advancements present fresh challenges to traditional religious frameworks. In this part, we'll explore how religious thought adapts to these pressures and speculate on where it might be headed in the future. One of the most significant trends of the modern age is the rise of secularism. Over the past few centuries, especially in the West, societies have increasingly separated religion from public life. In the past, religious institutions held immense power over political, economic, and social structures. Today, many countries are governed by secular laws, and religion has been pushed into the private sphere. This doesn't mean people have abandoned religious beliefs, but the role of religion in shaping public policy has diminished in many parts of the world. As secularism has grown, so too has the rise of atheism and agnosticism. For many, the advances in science, particularly in areas like cosmology, biology, and neuroscience, offer explanations for phenomena that were once attributed to the divine. As people became more educated and as scientific thinking became more prominent, some began questioning traditional religious narratives, particularly those that seemed at odds with scientific evidence. How could the biblical creation story align with what we now know about the age of the earth and evolution? In response, religious thought has had to shift. Many religious thinkers have worked to harmonize faith with scientific understanding, interpreting religious texts in metaphorical or allegorical terms. For example, the idea that God created the world in 7 days is now often viewed by many religious scholars as a symbolic story, rather than a literal historical account. This interpretative flexibility allows religion to retain its relevance in a world that increasingly relies on empirical evidence. However, this shift isn't universal. Some religious communities, particularly those adhering to more fundamentalist interpretations, reject the idea of harmonizing their beliefs with modern science. This has created a divide within religious traditions between those who embrace a more liberal theology and those who hold to a literal understanding of their sacred texts. Another development in the evolution of religious thought is globalization. For most of human history, religious traditions were geographically bound. But in today's world, religious ideas flow freely across borders. It's now possible for someone in one part of the world to explore religious traditions from across the globe with just a few clicks. This unprecedented level of access to different belief systems has changed how people think about religion. Many people now incorporate elements from multiple religious traditions into their personal belief systems. This blending of religious ideas, often referred to as syncretism, reflects a growing interest in spirituality over organized religion. Individuals are more likely to identify as spiritual but not religious, creating a form of belief that is personal and fluid, drawing on traditions ranging from Buddhism to Christianity to indigenous practices. This personalized approach to spirituality represents a major shift in how religion functions. Instead of adhering to a single religious institution's teachings, many now view spirituality as a personal journey. And this is both a challenge and an opportunity for traditional religions. On one hand, it means that religious institutions may struggle to maintain influence. On the other, it opens up space for religious thought to engage in new ways with people who are seeking meaning but are not necessarily attached to a particular religious tradition. The rise of technology and artificial intelligence, AI, adds another layer of complexity to the evolution of religious thought. As AI becomes more integrated into daily life, ethical and philosophical questions arise that challenge traditional religious teachings. Can machines have consciousness? What role should AI play in human society? Could AI ever understand or participate in religious experiences? Some religious thinkers argue that AI could be a tool for advancing spiritual understanding. They suggest that AI might help answer some of the deepest questions humans have about existence by analyzing vast amounts of religious and philosophical texts, potentially uncovering new insights into spiritual truths. Others are more cautious, seeing AI as a potential threat to human identity and the uniqueness of the soul. This debate forces religious thought to grapple with issues that were unimaginable even a few decades ago. How do ancient religious traditions respond to the technological challenges of the future? Do these new technologies change what it means to be human? And if so, what does that mean for traditional ideas about the soul, morality, and divinity? Then there's the issue of globalization and the way it has fostered interfaith dialogue. In the past, religious traditions often existed in isolation, with little interaction between them. Today, we live in multicultural, pluralistic societies where different religious groups live side by side. This proximity creates opportunities for dialogue and mutual understanding, but it also raises questions about truth and exclusivity. If multiple religious traditions claim to offer the ultimate truth, how do they coexist? Some religious thinkers advocate for pluralism, the idea that multiple paths can lead to the same divine truth. They argue that no single religion has a monopoly on the truth, and that different religious traditions offer unique insights into the nature of the divine and the human experience. This view is appealing in a world where people are increasingly aware of and influenced by diverse religious traditions. But not all religious traditions are open to this idea. For some, the very essence of their belief system is rooted in the idea that their faith is the one true path. This tension between exclusivity and inclusivity is a defining feature of modern religious thought. As societies become more interconnected, religious traditions are being forced to confront the reality of religious diversity in ways that they haven't before. And now we arrive at perhaps the most pressing question of all. Where is religious thought headed in the future? The future of religious thought likely depends on how well it can adapt to the rapid changes happening in the world. In some ways, religious thought is more flexible than ever. Liberal theology, syncretism, and pluralism show how adaptable religious ideas can be. On the other hand, fundamentalist movements and rigid interpretations of religious texts show that not all religious thought is open to change. Secularism will continue to play a major role, especially in highly developed societies where science, technology, and individualism dominate. However, the human need for meaning, purpose, and connection remains as strong as ever. People will continue to seek answers to life's big questions. Why are we here? What happens after we die? What is the right way to live? And religion in some form will continue to offer answers to those questions. As religious thought evolves, it's likely that we will see even more blending of spiritual and philosophical ideas. New movements drawing on ancient traditions but shaped by modern concerns will continue to emerge. New religious institutions that can adapt to the new realities of technology, globalization, and scientific understanding will likely remain influential. So those that cannot may struggle to find relevance in a rapidly changing world. The evolution of religious thought is far from over. In fact, it may just be entering its next great phase, a phase where ancient wisdom and modern realities collide to create new understandings of faith, spirituality, and the human experience. We need to explore the intersection of ancient beliefs and modern existential questions that have come to define our times. One of the most interesting developments is the relationship between religion and the environment. For thousands of years, religious thought has focused on humanity's place in the cosmos. But the environmental crises of the 21st century are pushing religious traditions to rethink that focus. Concepts like stewardship, creation care, and environmental ethics are gaining traction within religious communities as people begin to understand that how we treat the earth is deeply connected to how we think about the sacred. Many religious traditions have teachings that emphasize humanity's responsibility to care for the natural world. In Christianity, for example, the idea of stewardship is drawn from the Bible, where God gives humans dominion over the earth and the responsibility to care for it. However, in recent decades, this concept has evolved from one of control over nature to one of preservation and protection. Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si is a powerful example of how religious thought can adapt to new realities. In it, he calls for a moral and spiritual response to climate change, urging all people to protect the environment as part of their duty to future generations. In indigenous spiritual traditions, the relationship between humanity and nature has always been more symbiotic. Indigenous peoples around the world have long seen the earth not as something to be dominated, but as a living entity that sustains and nurtures life. This view is increasingly gaining attention in global conversations about environmental justice. Religious thought from indigenous traditions is influencing new generations of environmental activists who see the fight against climate change not only as a political and scientific battle, but as a moral and spiritual one. This evolving religious approach to the environment shows us that religious thought is increasingly being shaped by global crises. As people grapple with issues like climate change, poverty, and social injustice, they are turning to religious ideas not just for personal salvation, but for guidance on how to address these pressing challenges. The shift is profound. Religious thought is moving from a focus on individual morality to collective responsibility. What does it mean to live a good life when the world itself is under threat? This is the question modern religious thinkers are asking. Another area where religious thought is evolving is in the realm of human identity. Advances in medicine, psychology, and social sciences are reshaping our understanding of gender, sexuality, and the human body. Historically, religious traditions have had strong views on these issues, often defining gender roles and moral behaviors through strict interpretations of sacred texts. But in recent decades, many religious communities have been forced to confront new understandings of identity. Take, for instance, the increasing acceptance of LGBTQ individuals in religious spaces. While many religious institutions still maintain traditional views, others have embraced more inclusive interpretations of their texts, advocating for the full inclusion of LGBTQ people in religious life. This shift has been met with both celebration and resistance, as it challenges long-standing beliefs about the nature of humanity, sin, and morality. The conversation is far from settled, but it illustrates how religious thought is being reshaped by contemporary understandings of human identity and dignity. Religious communities are also rethinking their approach to gender roles. In many traditions, women have historically been excluded from leadership roles, but this too is changing. More religious denominations are ordaining women as clergy, allowing them to hold positions of power and influence within their communities. This shift is a response to both internal calls for reform and external pressures from broader societal movements for gender equality. As religious thought continues to evolve, questions about power, authority, and equality remain central to these discussions. Religious thought also faces a significant challenge from the rise of artificial intelligence and digital technologies. In the coming decades, AI will likely transform every aspect of human life, from how we work to how we interact with the world around us. But what does this mean for religion? Will AI ever be capable of understanding or participating in spiritual experiences? Can machines possess consciousness? And if so, what does that mean for our understanding of the soul? These are questions that religious thinkers are only beginning to grapple with, but they have profound implications for the future of religious thought. Some see AI as a tool that can enhance religious understanding, perhaps even helping to process complex theological ideas or creating new ways of experiencing spiritual practices. Others are more skeptical, worrying that AI could dehumanize religion, stripping away the mystery and emotion that makes spirituality such a deeply personal experience. One of the more radical ideas being discussed is the potential for digital immortality. With the rise of technologies like brain-machine interfaces and the possibility of uploading human consciousness to digital platforms, some futurists are asking whether it will one day be possible to live forever in a virtual world. This brings up all kinds of religious and philosophical questions. If a person's consciousness could be uploaded and preserved indefinitely, what would that mean for traditional concepts of the afterlife? Would this digital existence be equivalent to the soul? Could we achieve a kind of immortality through technology, and how would religious traditions respond to that? Religious thought has always been concerned with what happens after death, and this new frontier of technology forces a re-examination of those age-old questions. Some religious thinkers argue that digital immortality would still lack the essence of what it means to have a soul, something that, in many traditions, only a divine power can grant. Others believe that these technologies could challenge our understanding of life, death, and what it means to be human, requiring entirely new religious or philosophical frameworks. Finally, religious thought in the modern world is being shaped by a broader cultural shift toward pluralism and interfaith dialogue. For much of history, religious traditions existed in isolation from one another, and religious communities often saw themselves as having exclusive access to the truth. But today, the world is more interconnected than ever. People from different religious backgrounds are living side by side, working together, and sharing ideas. This has led to a growing recognition that no single tradition holds a monopoly on spiritual truth. Religious thinkers are increasingly open to the idea that different paths can lead to the same divine source. This doesn't mean that all religious differences disappear, but it does mean that there is more space for mutual understanding, respect, and learning across traditions. As we look toward the future, it's clear that religious thought will continue to evolve in response to the challenges and opportunities of modern life. Whether it's the environment, technology, human identity, or interfaith dialogue, religion remains a powerful force for shaping how we understand ourselves and the world. The evolution of religious thought is a story that is still unfolding. It's a journey that reflects humanity's deepest desires for meaning, connection, and transcendence. And while the future is uncertain, one thing is clear: religion will continue to adapt, inspire, and evolve, offering answers to questions we haven't even asked yet.